Okay, I'd like to talk to you today about a concept that very few people have probably heard of outside of the areas of folklore and early American, early Canadian history. And that's the idea of money digging and what historian Alan Taylor termed the supernatural economy in a book that he wrote around 1990. The book is called Liberty Men and Great Proprietors. There are other works that have been published on this, but it's a very, very interesting concept that a lot of people simply aren't aware of because it's kind of on the fringe between folklore and history and really kind of fits into both, but it's also sort of a fringe topic at the same time that a lot of people are not going to have encountered. It's a very interesting topic. I hope you'll bear with me with this, even though it's typical boring PowerPoint slides, but I'm hoping the content will be worth the effort to listen. So let's just kind of warm up with this and see a piece of doggerel from a poem called A Ballad of Old Pocock that was talking about treasure digging in Vermont circa 1900 or so, written by this Leonard Twinham fellow. And after the French and Indian Wars, his men with their precious haul were carrying metals and gems as loot to Quebec and Montreal. Very interesting way of leading into this topic. We'll see a little bit more of this this poem later on. I'm actually trying to get a complete copy of this, and I haven't found one online yet. But let's get a little bit of background in here. Some people are probably aware that legends of buried treasure were fairly common in certain areas around the U.S. I'm sure wherever you live, there are probably old legends that you've encountered, if you have read any local history at all, of some sort of buried treasure. These are very common in certain locations, less common in others. Obviously, very near the American coast or the Canadian coast, you will run into lots of treasure tales related to pirates. And these were extremely popular until at least the mid-19th century. They actually started off early in the colonial period. And as we'll see, as we talk about this, we had numerous protagonists who were potentially involved in it. You had pirates. They were very common, especially, again, along the coast. Although this is not exclusively true, there were actually a number of pirate tales related to treasure that were told far inland, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but there you go. We also have Native American tribes who were alleged in many cases to have vast hoards of gold and silver and other valuables secreted away in remote locations in the woods and in the mountains. We have French and, to a lesser degree, Spanish, and to an even greater degree, British groups who allegedly deposited wealth possibly stolen from somebody else or carried around as part of an expedition and then abandoned due to illness or lack of manpower or some other reason in the wilderness and forgotten. We also have, as another protagonist, military expeditions. If groups of soldiers or armies were marching around in the New England or Canadian wilderness, in many cases they would be carrying large sums of cash with them, either as bribes for Native American tribes or as payroll for the soldiers or for some other purpose. And in some cases it's alleged that they abandoned wealth in the wilderness in some location. And then finally we have a very interesting topic that is probably going to end up as a video of its own at some point when I have time, which is this concept of the lost tribe of Israel. There was a very common belief among the Jews that one tribe, I think it was the 10th tribe, allegedly vanished thousands of years ago. No one knew where they went, and there were numerous claims in the US and Canada that Native American tribes were actually that lost tribe. And this is a very interesting topic. We're going to touch on this because it kind of plays into some of these treasure legends. Now, I'm going to concentrate in this talk on the U.S. eastern seaboard and Canada, probably out to roughly the no further west than the Mississippi River, simply because once you get out to the west, you start getting a lot more Spanish influence. You get a lot more gold mines, lost Dutchman mine, gold mine type of influence. There's also some vague claims of Inca or Mayan or Aztec gold abandoned in the desert southwest, and I'm not really going to touch on those because that's not an area that I've really concentrated on, and I think we have enough material to really talk about here in this context without going all that far out west. Now, this whole concept of lost treasure, buried treasure, hidden treasure, this is not a modern invention. These tales have been around for thousands of years. You can find these in stories dating back to Greece and Egypt in ancient times. But what happened was when these tales were kind of introduced into North America, the context and the type of telling were changed to kind of a more specific usage. If you look at some of those older tales from the old world, a lot of them were the kind of once upon a time type of tale, where it was a mythical past, it was kind of a remote location, it was some long dead king or monarch or somebody like that who had abandoned the treasure, and there was not much specificity around a lot of these things. What happened in the American, and I use American to mean North America, context, is that more specific locations and names got introduced into tellings over here. So that if you were growing up in Wheeling, West Virginia, in the Ohio Valley, they would tell a treasure legend about the Ohio Valley using the Ohio River or the area around Wheeling, West Virginia, or the area around a nearby town, and there would probably be names like the bog's name or some other name used that was known to be very common in the area, so that these tales took on an immediacy that made them a lot more believable and plausible. This wasn't a once upon a time thing. It became more of a right down the road, this family lost this treasure and it's still buried out there somewhere type of tale. And as such, it became a lot more believable, and people were more willing to accept these tales and actually act on them. In Europe, you saw a lot of different protagonists and contexts. Obviously in the U.S., we have the group that we mentioned in the previous slide, but in Europe you had things like treasure left by Danes or Vikings while they were roving around England or Ireland. You had local conflicts, the English Civil War, and other events causing nobles or local barons or some other noble to flee an area and potentially hide his treasure in a remote location where it allegedly still exists because the noble was killed and never revealed the location of the treasure. You also had money and jewels hidden by thieves, fairly common to the area. This is kind of adapted into the more piratical theme that we see here in North America. There are a lot of really common motifs here that span across countries and regions. So if you go to Spain, China, if you go to India, Japan, various and sundry other older locations, you would probably find very similar motifs. But again, the stories would change slightly to meet the available individuals in that area. In India, you might have a Maharaja forced to flee south by the Mughal Empire or something like that, who abandoned his treasure in a well or something to that effect. So these things always have to have a context that makes sense. Now, I referred on the first slide to this concept of money diggers, and I want to make sure everybody understands what I mean by that. This is a very colloquial term used to describe these kind of hoaxers or scam artists who were basically employed by local individuals to locate buried treasure or other valuables that they thought might exist in a given area. These were not an American invention. In the UK, England, you had a very similar type of individual. They were also claiming some sort of supernatural ability, and they were generally referred to as hill diggers, which is a very pejorative term because these people were considered low-life scam artists, not to be trusted, but at the same time they still existed and took advantage of people who were not educated enough to understand what kinds of activities they were engaged in. Now, these people claimed some sort of supernatural ability. They claimed to have the ability to use magic, different types of folk magic, which we'll discuss shortly, when locating buried or hidden treasure. They also claimed to have the ability to create protective spells to ward off the treasure guardians, which we'll also discuss later, who were said to actually protect these buried treasures. And in an interesting twist, in many cases you find kind of a mix of folk religion and folk magic with divination, scrying, and various and sundry other forms of so-called magic mixed in with religious iconography. For example, rather than using a spell to keep a treasure guardian from stealing the treasure away while it was being dug up, a given money digger might use a common prayer out of the Bible, or they might have somebody read a Bible verse as a protective measure against the treasure guardian snatching the treasure away. In a lot of cases, these people were also aided by Confederates. This is not always the case, but sometimes they would hire somebody local who knew the area and who knew the local inhabitants and who had the most money, and they would use them as patsies in basically in order to establish their credibility in a given area. This Confederate might help them establish their alleged abilities by burying a coin in some remote location and having the treasure hunter go find it, the treasure digger go find this thing, thereby proving his ability or her ability, because this was not all men, to actually perform this type of divination. And these tricks could be done on one's own. You did not necessarily need a Confederate to do this. There are various kind of conjuring tricks that certain people have become very skilled at. They involve types of cold reading and certain aspects of physiology that I won't get into in great detail here that would help somebody find this type of a hidden object using the person who actually hid it. It's a very long story. Maybe at some point I'll do a video on how that was done. These people were basically the predecessors of modern psychics who make these wild claims about being able to help lost people or somebody who was murdered or lost valuables or predict the future, that sort of thing. Same kind of mode of operation, same kind of wild claims, complete failure to deliver on these claims, but it's the same kind of concept. It's just that modern psychics have kind of abandoned the treasure hunting motif and the certain use of divination in favor of more modern practice, crystal balls, remote viewing, or other types of pseudoscientific practices. And here we see kind of another little verse from Old Pocock. He carried a magic divining rod, a miraculous crystal stone, by which in the darkened crown of his hut he could fix a spot unknown. This refers to a form of divination known as scrying, which was fairly commonly used by these people, and in this case, what they're talking about is using what was called a peepstone or seer stone, and there's actually an image of one of these later on in the presentation, that somebody would literally take their hat off, take this little stone or crystal or whatever it was out of their pocket, put it inside the hat, hold the hat upside down, lower their face over it, and then they would walk around looking at the ground, quote unquote, through the hat, through the stone, and by this means it was said that they could actually see buried treasure under the ground. So you can see what kind of belief system we're dealing with here. But this is the type of thing that went on fairly commonly. Other people would simply use divining rods, that sort of divination, where similar to what you see today, when people claim the ability to find water through this kind of divination. Dowsers. Now, let's talk about all these individual groups that we mentioned earlier on in the talk. First of all, we have these pirates. Pirate treasure legends were extremely common all along the east coast of the US and Canada, obviously. The most famous one that I can think of is one that I've studied for years, which is the Oak Island Money Pit legend in Nova Scotia. I have several videos on that on YouTube if you're interested, or if you haven't already watched them. And this was considered initially a location for Captain Kidd's treasure. We had many famous pirates. We had Kidd, we had Blackbeard, Bluebeard, John Lafitte, various and sundry other pirates who plied their trade along the East Coast, or were thought to have plied their trade along the East Coast. And Kidd's treasure, just as a reference, this is from Skinner's book, Myths and Legends of Our Time. This list shows Gardiner's Island, Dunderberg, Crow's Nest, New York City, and Coney Island in New York, Ipswich, Massachusetts, the marshes back of Boston, what is probably the Back Bay today, Cape Cod, Nantucket in Massachusetts, the Isles of Shoals, which lie off of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Money Island, Ocean Beach, then we have completely different locations here, the Bahamas and the Florida Keys. These are all proposed locations for Kidd's treasure, to give you an idea how widely scattered these beliefs were. Now, some treasure was actually found on Gardiner's Island, and there are stories that this was allegedly the source of the John Jacob Astor fortune. Whether that's true or not is unknown, but obviously people would tend to take that kind of a find as a source for somebody's wealth, undeserved or deserved, depending on how you look at it. And again, the Oak Island Money Pit was originally thought to be a site for the Kidd treasure. Now, moving over to native tribes, again, we had a lot of stories of Indians or Native Americans who allegedly had vast amounts of gold or silver. This is absolutely not true. To my knowledge, any native tribes that were found had minimal amounts of gold, which was probably completely unrefined. They may have had some very, very small items that had been imported from other locations, possibly even as far south as Mexico, where the Incas and Mayas did a lot of gold work. But there were these massive stories of Native American gold mines where this was being processed. One story that I read recently was set in the Shawangunk Mountains of New York, and this settler alleged that he was blindfolded and taken into the mountains by a native who showed him this cave where the tribe had been mining gold for centuries, and they had all this gold bullion piled up, and they had a small smelting furnace where they could melt down ore and refine it. And this guy was so taken by this concept that after the native led him back to his home, he allegedly, and this is a very common folkloric motif in treasure stories, spent the rest of his life trying to relocate the site, never did, died never having found it. Very, very common theme in treasure tales, just as there's a very common theme that you'll see in many, many treasure stories of what is known as the deathbed confession, where somebody confesses to have buried the treasure in some location, or that his treasure lies in a certain location, this island by this island, next to the big oak tree, and if somebody goes and finds it, he'd be very happy, and then he dies, and people go off looking for the treasure that he allegedly had described. And of course, they never find it either because it probably didn't exist. Many settlers were absolutely convinced that these native tribes had some sort of wealth hidden away. They could not believe that these people did not deal in gold and silver, and this may very well be similar to the belief that Columbus had when he landed in the Caribbean, that the islanders had gold mines, they had gold objects hidden away, and he was so desperate to find this that he actually resorted to torturing natives wholesale, chopping off hands and beating them and whipping them and things like that, really nasty things, in order to find this gold that actually never existed. So there may be some association between what Columbus did and these beliefs in the colonies in Canada about all these gold mines. Again, military and government, we talked about that early on. Very common source for treasure claims. Here are a couple of examples. One where Governor Wentworth, an English governor, allegedly abandoned a bunch of valuables somewhere between Smith's Pond and Portsmouth, New Hampshire during the Revolution. I would be extremely happy if this was actually true, because I live very close to this area and I would love to be the person who found this, but alas, it's probably entirely imaginary. There's absolutely no proof that this ever actually happened. And if it did, more than likely it was found hundreds of years ago and has been spirited away and somebody has it. Another story of Hessian troops, German mercenaries, burying valuables in a howitzer, which is a type of cannon, somewhere near Dalton, Massachusetts. There's an old story from Crown Point, New Hampshire, about a French fort abandoned during the French and Indian Wars or somewhere thereabouts, and allegedly the French garrison dumped a massive amount of money and bullion down into a hollow in one of the bastions, which is part of the fort, and hid it away there so that they could come back and get it later. They moved out. The English took over. These legends grew up, and allegedly people were digging in this area all over the remains of this fort for years and years, down to 100 feet below the fort, in efforts to try to find this treasure. Of course, there was nothing there. Third one, Shandanken Valley, Catskills, New York, site of money allegedly buried by British officers on the run during the American Revolution. These are just some brief examples, but this is the type of story that you'll run into if you're interested in this sort of material. And then finally, the Lost Tribe of Israel. Very, very interesting topic. Shows how people can really self-delude based on wishful thinking. 1650, we have the first known mention of this concept with this book or pamphlet that somebody published called The Hope of Israel, suggesting that the alleged lost tribe of Israel might actually be some sort of Native American tribe, and maybe these were survivors of the Assyrian exile or something to that effect. Very next year, Thorogood's book, which was fairly well known, Jews in America, which talks about alleged similarities between the Jews and various Native American tribes. I've seen modern interpretations of this where people still believe that this is the case. And there's absolutely no reason to believe this. It makes no sense whatsoever. But back in the day, Cotton Mather, William Penn, two very famous figures in American history, were supporters of this, as were many, many other people. This belief continued at least throughout the colonial era. It still persists among certain fringe groups today. I've recently seen a website where somebody was comparing certain types of hairstyles sported by Native American tribes that were photographed in the early 1900s against similar styles that the Jews in the Levant used during various periods. I've seen people trying to compare scripts and other practices, various things about appearance, skin color, all sorts of other different crazy things to try to prove this was the case. And you can see this 1831 quote here where similarities included likeness in color, features, hair, aptness to cunning, which is a very kind of telling phrase, I think, and dispositions for roving, which is even more unusual. But if you look at the genetic evidence, basic DNA shows that Native American tribes were totally unrelated to Jews of the Levant or anywhere else in Southern Europe, the Middle East, of any location. Completely different genetic tree. However, that said, people still believe this. But this played into some of the treasure beliefs because it was thought that if one of these tribes actually was this lost tribe of Israel, that they might have brought biblical artifacts or gold or other valuables with them that could potentially answer religious questions or be used to establish a Jewish homeland or something to that effect. So this obviously played into people's thinking for a great many years. Okay, now swinging back to divination, here's a couple of examples. Here, upper left-hand side is an example of a peepstone or seer stone that I mentioned earlier in the talk. This is actually one that allegedly was owned by Joseph Smith Jr. of Mormonism fame. And this is something that was probably a few inches across that he would have carried in a pocket. And again, if he was going to perform scrying, he would have taken this out of his pocket, taken his hat off, put the stone in the hat, put his face inside the hat, and then used the image allegedly projected by the stone in order to locate the treasure that he was after. In the middle here, we have an old woodcut from the 1640s, I believe this is from Germany, showing a guy in the middle holding a couple of sticks who's obviously engaged in dowsing. Dowsing was claimed to be a possible means for finding gold, valuables, jewelry, buried ores of different types, and also obviously water, which some people still claim today that dowsing for water is an accurate method of finding it. And to show how this was actually studied, here on the right we have the frontispiece from a book called Crystal Gazing, written by Andrew Lang in the latter 19th century. Lang was a student of folklore. He accumulated a massive amount of folklore, did a lot of studying, actually wrote some of his own as an attempt to kind of figure out how somebody would put a folktale together, and he did a whole book on crystal gazing and telepathic scrying. So if you're interested in reading up on this, I'm sure you could find a copy of Lang's book online, and it might make for very interesting reading. So what kind of tales will we see around this? Most of these are taken from several sources that I have that talk about different events that have been recorded over the years. We have one here, Divination and Money Digging. This guy, Mr. K, we have no idea what his real name was persuaded that two little girls in New York could see by looking into tumblers of water, another version of scrying. You didn't need a stone in the hat, you could use a tumbler of water. Any hidden treasure or stolen property, by their direction, he spent all the money he could obtain. Sounds like somebody playing the lottery with or gambling in Las Vegas, to find hidden and lost property with the strongest confidence that he should obtain immense treasures by these means. Very, very common theme here. Somebody spending all the money they have in an absolute convinced way that they're going to see a massive return on that investment. They're going to have easy money, and they just keep doubling down with more and more money because they think it's going to happen. And referring back to Oak Island, the money pit mystery there are several cases where divination was used on the island. The first case that I know of is around 1845. There was a pit called the Fanny Young Pit, named for the clairvoyant that they hired, who came over and told them that a certain location was the ideal place to dig. Another document, an 1893 prospectus put together by a treasure syndicate that was digging at that time, had this phrase in it: the man with me had a mineral rod, again a dowsing rod of sorts, and it worked all right at the money pits. The rod drew toward it from all points right to one spot. Again, use of divination, trying to find treasure. There's another feature on Oak Island that was actually put in the 1950s and 60s called Borehole 10X, which was created by one of the more recent treasure hunting companies. This is a 200-foot deep pit that goes all the way down to bedrock that was drilled at that time, and I'm told by people who were in the know that dowsing was used to site that pit. And also, one should note that no treasure has ever been found there in over 150 years. Now, here's a typical kind of money-digging event in action. One of our heroes arrives at a location. He walks into town, rides into town, goes to a local pub, sits around, starts talking to the locals, makes a claim that he can find treasure by divination. They say, prove it, put your money where your mouth is. So he decides to prove his claim by locating a coin or some other objects that they've hidden for him. This could be hidden in a field, in a stream, in a wall, who knows, pick some location that everybody could agree on. He figures out how to find this based on prior knowledge or cold reading, fairly classic psychic technique. And after he's proven that he can actually do this, even though he's been cheating, the locals pay him to help find a local treasure. Now, this local treasure could be, again, some local legend of pirate treasure, Native American gold, money buried by one of the other protagonists that we've talked about, the military, French and Indians, who knows. They go out to this location, they dig, they usually, of course, find nothing. They have, to my knowledge, none of these expeditions ever found anything. And then the excuses start. The money digger's directions were not followed to the letter. The signs weren't aligned properly, or evil spirits or guardians, the treasure guardians, have spirited the treasure away under their very noses. And there are all sorts of excuses about this. That's how one of these things usually works. It's a scam in action. Here's an example. Lambert's Folly. This was recounted in Alan Taylor's book, Liberty, Men, and Great Proprietors. Kennebec, Maine, around 1800, this guy named Daniel Lambert showed up and basically walked into town with fistfuls of banknotes. Literally was seen around town lighting cigars with banknotes, claiming to be that rich. Also said that he had this massive level of skill, occult skills with divining rods, was able to find all this wealth, had tremendous success, probably brought a few people with him who supported his claims, who were working with him. And we have this quote from 1851 where this guy recalled that he inoculated the entire population of the Kennebec Valley with treasure-seeking mania. So people were found digging from Anson to Seguin and all along the coast, even to Rhode Island. Eventually, they figured out that the Lamberts were part of a ring of counterfeiters who were using this illusion of discovered treasure and passing out forged banknotes, which is exactly what he was lighting cigars with. Again, he walked into town lighting cigars with these fake banknotes, persuaded many of the townspeople to give him pretty much all of their money, sometimes livestock, other valuables that they might have had, jewelry, who knows what else. Had this claim of being able to locate treasure via divination, and then vanished overnight. Probably into Nova Scotia. Nobody knows what really happened to him. That may not have even been his real name. The fun thing about this is that allegedly the local residents celebrated what they called St. Lambert's Day for many years afterward. Who knows what the celebrations actually looked like. They may have paraded an effigy of Lambert and burned him in the town's center, or maybe they had a huge feast around the whole thing. Who knows exactly what they did? But it's very amusing that they actually kind of took this whole thing with a grain of salt and made it into a piece of local folklore and tradition. Another example. Here's a guy, this is not involving divination per se, but these were people apparently digging for an alleged treasure. Allegedly, this guy struck something like the top of a box, forced the spear into it, and another classic motif in treasure folklore, could distinctly hear the rattling of pieces of metal. This is the same story that was told at the Oak Island Money Pit when they were drilling into the alleged treasure, that they could hear pieces of metal being moved around by the drill. Held the spear there while others dug out the box. Not a word was spoken, but then somebody made a mistake. Somebody said, "We've got it at last." It wasn't out of the treasure hole yet. They had not completely recovered it. The box was torn from their hands and vanished into the hole, rattling as it went. And then they were blown out of the hole by a great wind. Absolutely classic. Verbatim story from this area. Now, this whole idea of the treasure moving is part and parcel to these tales, because there were actual claims that some of these treasures were not static. They were actually almost living. There's this concept of the treasure hoard as dynamic, that it moved around, so that's one of the reasons you needed a money digger, was to help you find out where the treasure had moved to. The size of the hoard might grow or shrink over time. There were also stories of treasure hoards doing these things called blossoming or sunning, which would mean that they would rise closer to the surface at certain intervals, 100 years, maybe on the anniversary of the date when they were buried, on the anniversary of the death of the man who buried them. Various and sundry other stories were told around this. At this point, when the treasure was close to the surface, it might give off a bluish light, which was referred to as a will-o'-the-wisp, and will-o'-the-wisp can be found in many other types of folk tales. Same sort of thing. There's some sort of supernatural component allegedly involved in this. Supposedly, it was easier to find and pull out when it was blossoming or sunning itself like this. But again, any error would cause the treasure to travel to a new location and be lost. And this traveling might be the treasure itself moving, which is interesting enough, a belief in itself, or the treasure guardians that were in charge of it might be moving it out of harm's way because they had gotten wind that somebody was trying to uncover it. Now, who were these guardians? Lots of different types you can find in the tradition and in various contexts. In some cases, in pirate stories, there are tales of a crew member being killed and buried with the treasure. There's one story that I read recently where the new pirate unwisely says that he'll be the guardian when the captain says who's going to guard the treasure. He says, "I'll do it." They kill him. They bury him with the treasure. He becomes the guardian. Another story that I ran across many years ago said that pirates considered a strong black slave to be an ideal treasure guardian, so that one of them would be killed on top of the treasure and buried with it, and he would become the treasure guardian. They could also place a curse on the chest itself or on the treasure itself when they were actually depositing it in the hole, preventing people from getting it, or in some cases the devil himself would show up as a treasure guardian. This is a very, very common folkloric motif. We see this even today. If you are a player of adventure video games, online video gaming, or any types of board video game or board adventure games, in a lot of cases, if you're trying to recover a treasure of any kind of size, there's a guardian on top of it. Think of the Hobbit, Smaug the dragon, sitting on top of his hoard. You have to kill the dragon in order to get the hoard. Or you have to defeat the traps, Indiana Jones style. You have to get past the traps that are guarding the treasure in order to recover it. Same kind of concept. So this is a very, very old concept. This is not a very new idea in American folklore. In Irish folklore, we see leprechauns, imps, or other supernatural creatures. We also see animistic variants with animals of different types: bull, deer, horse, several other types that you can find in various treasure legends. In Scandinavia, we see giants, trolls, and other supernatural creatures being used as treasure guardians. A general rule you can kind of look at is that the type of guardian will be based on local practice or tradition. So if you go to an Islamic or Arabic country, you will probably find jinns or genies being named as treasure guardians. In Christian locales, the devil or some sort of evil spirit will be named as the treasure guardian. And again, animals can appear in many locations worldwide. And here we have an illustration on the right of a jinn guarding a treasure. This is the actual probable end of 99.9% of all such treasure hunts that actually went on. I love this piece of art. This is John Kedor's Money Diggers from 1832. This is held in the Brooklyn Museum. And to recount what is actually visible here, on the left we have a guy running away in terror from something that has obviously just happened. In the middle we have another guy recoiling in terror from something that's apparently coming out of the hole that he's terrified of, but his knees are knocking together. He's obviously in great consternation at what's going on, but what you can't see is that he's looking up and to the right side of the picture, the upper right-hand corner. There's the face of a man sticking out who's yelling something. Maybe he startled these people in the middle of the night. Maybe he's the owner of the land that they're digging on. Maybe he's the treasure guardian. We don't know that. And then down below, there's another guy climbing out of the pit in desperation, who's obviously going to start running as quickly as possible. Now, one aspect of this that I'd like to point out is that right next to the pickaxe is a bottle of what looks to be alcohol, strong spirits of some sort. And whenever I read these tales of money diggers and people going off into the woods and digging by firelight and trying to recover treasure, the image that keeps popping into my mind is that of what we in the United States call a snipe hunt, which is a very common thing where you take some unwitting individual or a couple of individuals who don't know anything about a given area into the woods. You give them a flashlight and a bag, and you tell them to walk around saying, here snipe, and that by doing so a snipe will come out and it will jump into the bag and they can go home with their snipe. Nobody ever tells them what a snipe is. Actually, there are types of birds called snipes, but that's probably not what we're referring to here. But basically what happens is the person is left in the woods for a long period of time. There's probably been alcohol involved. He's probably slightly drunk. And at some point, some or all of his friends will have manufactured a ruse where they can jump out and scare him half to death, and he'll go running off home. Basically, that's what we're seeing is the same kind of image here. It's the same kind of thing. Here's a quote from Ben Franklin from one of his publications in the mid-1700s. They wander through the woods and bushes by day to discover the marks and signs, which are allegedly indications that treasure is buried in a given area. And this could be anything from a mark on a tree to a mark on a rock, or any number of other potential signs that would potentially reveal the location of a treasure. Full of expectation, they labor violently, trembling at the same time at every joint through fear of certain malicious demons, our trusty guardian spirits, who are said to haunt and guard such places. So there we have it, kind of in a nutshell. Now, why would people do this? Why would these legends and tales be so popular? Why would people go off and dig in all these different locations believing that they were going to find this? What would motivate them to do that? Obviously, there's the motivation of finding a vast amount of money, but this is also a form of folk religion. This is very similar to playing the lottery. Why work hard if you can get rich by playing a game? If you can go off in the middle of the night and dig a hole in a given location and there's a decent odds-on chance, you think, that you're going to find a vast amount of money, why not give it a try? Very similar to playing the lottery, buying a ticket. I'm sitting at the gas station anyway. Why not spend $2 and take a chance? Many accounts exist of settlers all across New England shirking work, neglecting their fields, neglecting building their houses, neglecting milking their cows because they're off doing treasure digs. There are tales of whole sections of Maine that were near the coast that were dug up. There were holes everywhere because people were out all day digging for treasure. You could also think of the imagery of people using their rent or utility money to play the lottery because they figured that maybe they'll get lucky and they'll have that one big score that will set them up for life. This whole kind of rags to riches dream. Because remember, something that very few people really understand is most of the people in these areas were dirt poor. They were eking out a living in the woods or in a small town or in a small village. They were working their fingers to the bone. They probably had very little money, they had no leisure time, and the idea of striking it rich like this was certainly very appealing. Now, there's also something that may play into this. This is an idea that Alan Dundas, who was a very famous folklorist, proposed some time back, which is the idea of unlimited good. If you look at traditional peasant culture in the old world, they operated more on the concept of what was known as limited good, which is a closed system. The idea that health, wealth, friendship, love, manliness, honor, all these other different great things were in short supply. There were limited supplies of these things, so that if somebody else got money, that meant somebody else had to lose money because the system was balanced. There was only a certain amount of money, certain amount of health, certain amount of love to go around. So they thought everything worked on the limited good principle. However, once you get to the United States and even Canada, the New World in general, the attitude changed because there was so much available over here. There was land that was basically unsettled. There were unlimited stocks of game. There was wood. There were fish. There were all these different things that could be had in abundance. So the idea of unlimited good became fairly part and parcel to the New World experience. So we have these operative phrases that we hear in the United States all the time. There's plenty more where that came from, or the sky's the limit. This idea of the Americas in general as a land of opportunity, so that you didn't have to worry about if you made money, somebody else had to lose. Everybody could make money. Everybody could be rich. That's one of the great myths of the Americas. However, there's also a contravening principle here, which is the Protestant work ethic, or the work ethic in general, that came to America during this period. This idea of honest work as the only way to achieve wealth is extremely strong in the early American experience, and even today. It's a highly valued myth, and by myth I do not mean falsehood. I mean myth as in the way a society explains itself to itself in American society. The idea of treasure hunting kind of blows the holes in that idea, because what you're saying is that you're going to get easy wealth by digging a hole in the right location. It's not hard work, it's luck, it's maybe fate. It's getting rich quickly. You didn't put in all the work necessary to get this money. You're not deserving of it. This is more similar to peasant thinking. You have to work hard in order to get anywhere. Again, compare this with playing the lottery or betting on horses. Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, was in Brazil in the 1950s on a sabbatical and met a lot of the local Brazilians, and he said he was struck by a contrast between two people that he met. One was a group of women who had started off with a broken down old sewing machine and a little shack, doing piecework, mending, and things like that for locals in order to make a living. And they had become so good at this and so successful at this that they had actually acquired more machines. They had acquired a shop that was actually viable as a real working location. It wasn't just a little shack. They had actually been able to hire people to work for them, and were expanding their business by reinvesting their money back into the business. Very traditional kind of American model. Contrast that with a taxi driver that he talked with, who said that he was going to get rich by playing the ponies. Literal phrase. In other words, he was betting on horses. This guy's attitude was, any extra money I get, I'm going to throw it at betting on the horses, because that's how I'm going to get rich. I'm going to hit my stake, and then I will be set for life. Two different, drastically diverging opinions and approaches to life. So is there a moral lesson in here? And I should probably change this italicized phrase, because this might be the reason that all these treasure tales, not just American, but probably also worldwide, never really end with the treasure being found. This is probably a reinforcement of that work ethic concept. You can go off and try to get rich quick all you want, but it's not going to work. Something is always going to make this not happen. You're going to fail at this. You might as well go do your work and get it done properly. Then you can get rich ethically and legitimately. There's also potentially the idea of ill-gotten gains. If you're talking about pirate treasure that was stolen in the first place, then by acquiring that pirate treasure, would you also acquire the moral taint or the ethical taint of being involved in the theft? So there's a greed factor involved there. Another possible lesson, the idea is that the treasure technically belongs to whoever buried it. Maybe this is another approach you could think of. So that taking it or actually acquiring it would be actually unethical or sinful. These are definite considerations around this whole thing. This is something that you should think about if you're investigating these things. And I would love to hear other people's opinions on this, because I think it's a very interesting way to approach these stories from a folkloric and kind of a societal standpoint. So to summarize and end this thing up, we have a lot of different forms of legends, a lot of different protagonists. We can talk about all these different people, pirates and military expeditions and so forth, who were involved in these alleged events. A really cool study in folk beliefs. We have this kind of fusion of folk magic that was non-Christian in conjunction with religion, use of Bible verses and prayer in order to recover treasure. Very interesting mix of different belief systems there. We have several holdouts of older beliefs in supernatural beings with spirits and devils and things like that being in control of these treasure hoards. We also have these characters known as money diggers, who were basically, I call them a pre-industrial equivalent of fortune tellers or psychics. Same kind of attitude, same kind of operation, method of operation. They prey on the beliefs and the gullibility of uneducated locals. They take advantage of the poor who were desperately seeking a way out of their bad situation. They're scam artists who take the money and run. Same kind of mentality, same kind of mode of operation. Now these motifs and the conclusion of these legends, how they end up and how they play out in all these different stories, can tell us a lot about the attitude toward money, toward wealth, toward success, toward any number of things in the area in question. And if you're reading these things, if you're interested in this, always make sure to think about the era in which these tales were written, because the era in which they were written will have a direct effect on how they're structured, how the protagonists are portrayed, how the people who are doing the digging are portrayed, and what the outcomes are. And with that, I will leave you with this bibliography, which you can get most of these things online. Some of them are actually from scholarly journals. The top 4 or 5 are from scholarly journals, so you would need access to a university or to buy copies of these publications in order to get them. The 2 links at the bottom, Myths and Legends of Our Own Land, is available online at Gutenberg and numerous other locations. And Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, here's the ISBN. It was published in May 1990. Very, very interesting book. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have comments, questions, or ideas for follow-on the presentations or videos about this type of material or something related, please get in touch. And I look forward to seeing your comments online. Thanks for listening.